Welcome to the Environmental Transformation Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Grady, and today's guest is Dan Overbey. Dan is a fellow LEED practitioner. He's just a professor of agriculture, of architecture. I'm sorry. Oh, goodness. We probably need to restart this whole thing. No, we're going to keep going, though. He's a professor of architecture at Ball State University, and he's the director of sustainability at Browning Day in Indianapolis. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks, Sean. It's great to be back.
Yeah, I'm glad you're back. Hey, guess what, fans? Listen to this, guys. ET Nation. So we had Dan on episode 10. So here we are. We're going on episode 64. So 53 episodes later, Dan is coming back to the show, and we are going to talk about LEED Zero. And oh my goodness, Dan, that previous episode 10 was one of our most listened to episodes. I was shocked to see how many people were really interested in, LEED building, green buildings, and that topic was really resonating with our listeners. And I was scrolling on LinkedIn, and there you go again, posting something up very beneficial to everybody that's in LinkedIn. And I saw your little article going from zero carbon, do not forget about transportation. And I was like, wow, that sounds like an interesting topic. Let's talk about this a little further, because so many times people don't really think about factoring in transportation emissions into their evaluation of their carbon impact on projects. And so that was the genesis of why we wanted to bring you back on the show and start this conversation. But I think what's really kind of driving the underlying, article that you wrote was all about LEED Zero, right? I mean, how do we achieve LEED Zero? And so let's talk about LEED Zero and what it includes, and how is it really helping us achieve our goal of, decarbonizing and, looking forward to a regenerative future. Let's talk about that through building design, and then, help us understand what the program covers.
Let's do it. And it's great to be back, Sean. I'll just say, usually people say that the sequel is not as good as the original. So I'll try this next episode here to and talking about this expanded platform within the LEED framework. I'll try to outdo episode 10. Thanks for having me back. And we've been aware of LEED Zero for a bit at my firm. We hadn't had a project opportunity to look into this much until a particular project opportunity came along. And when you work on a building project or a landscape architecture project, a site development, it always comes with owner project requirements. And increasingly, we're seeing our clientele come to us saying, hey, we need some clear, measurable sustainability objectives. We need to go beyond just designing with good intent, even with the rigors of building simulation modeling, that we want to hold ourselves accountable to the performance outcomes. And that's really where LEED Zero starts. Is if any audience members remember that episode 10, when we talked about LEED in general, and we talked about the certification model and how that goes from basically your ground level basic certification, silver, gold, and platinum. It's based on 110 points, but it's all really about what happens before the building's occupied. It has to do with the design, the construction. The LEED framework has added more performance and measurement checks within it. Mm-hmm. And we can get into some of those details, but it does prompt project teams to report data for years after a building is occupied. But where we are starting to move now with sustainability, with green buildings, is still doing everything we can to design and construct with the best intent, with as much rigor and measurement as we can, but to really look at the performance. It's really all about how it performs. And LEED Zero is an expanded framework of the LEED platform that helps us get there. And there's 4 tiers to that. and they're looking at 4 different ways to measure the performance outcomes of a project. So one is on energy, and so it's where you take the source energy, how much energy is used within the boundaries of the project, looking at that over the course of a year, and just seeing that the building will actually produce more energy than what it consumes. And so you get there by, as we've talked about before, an integrative project team, multiple disciplines coming to the table. You reduce energy requirements as much as you can. You're never going to completely eliminate it, but you bridge that gap at the end with green energy that's produced on site.
So some of the things we're talking like, solar power, right? Is that kind of factored into the green energy, equations of the design? There's obviously, these light sensors that, lights come on automatically and turn off, all these little things like that are kind of built into the design of achieving the, a zero energy goal, right?
It is. You nailed it. We are looking at the combined effect of all of those strategies that you're on track with the technology, the role of technology with smart systems, with building management systems. And that technology is helping us to, you don't have to necessarily turn off a light switch when you leave a room. It's going to sense who's in the space, who leaves the space. It's going to change ventilation and lighting requirements based on what's happening outside, what's happening inside. You can get very sophisticated with the controls now, Sean, and you can really start to achieve a whole other tier of performance. And so, yeah, you reduce down the energy requirement through good design, through these controls, through efficient mechanical systems, through LED lighting, harvesting daylight as much as you can. And what LEED Zero Energy calls for is, hey, let's measure it for a year. And if you are zero energy, then you can get certified for that. And then they have 3 additional variations, the same kind of idea. You take that same year-long measurement, that performance period, and you can also do the same for water. You can also get certified with LEED Zero for waste and for carbon. And so for this project that we're looking at right now, we were coming into it with the objective of measured, verified net zero energy. We're using the LEED Zero Energy platform as well as carbon, zero carbon. So we're looking at how can we create a zero carbon project, and the LEED Zero Carbon platform actually requires teams to look not just at the building itself, but the transportation carbon intensity of the users of the building. That was something we had never really confronted before. And this is where the conversation in sustainability keeps becoming more sophisticated, more elaborate, more comprehensive, better, more accountable.
More extending the assessment, right? Further out, right? Not just the immediate, and that's really good. So, are you seeing a bunch of clients actually driving towards raising their hand up saying, I want to be LEED Zero? Like, this is part of what we want to do as part of our design, our goals we want to achieve as a company. Because it seems to me like these are like for new construction builds, right? This isn't like for an existing structure for the most part. Is that correct, or am I wrong?
We are seeing a couple of trends in the marketplace. I would say the last time we got together and we talked about this, I would have told you that we saw the most interest in higher education, and that makes sense. They're going to own and operate their buildings. We are now seeing as much demand on the corporate side. We're seeing increasingly corporate leadership saying, hey, we are looking at our carbon footprint from all aspects of our operations, and that includes our building stock. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at our existing buildings too. I think it was within the last 3 months, Sean, the American Institute of Architects released their latest firm survey report. And what we found is that almost half the work that's happening in the United States with architecture firms is on a square footage basis is investing in existing buildings to some degree. I think that's a great case because if we talk about carbon, some of the most carbon intensive parts of our buildings would be the so-called bricks and mortar, the structure, the enclosure. That's where you have concrete. That's some of the most carbon intensive material that we can use, and to save that, to spare that, and to give it new life, to extend its life again. That's some of the best stuff we can do from a carbon standpoint with our buildings.
Reuse. Yeah, exactly. Well, as you go through that journey, I think there's a concept that maybe, clients will wrestle with. It's like, what's the difference between net zero versus net neutral? And I think a lot of people listening may think, oh, that's the same. But there are some nuances that you really need to understand, that there is slightly, some differences, and they kind of mean similar things, but not quite. So I thought maybe we could just dive into that just a little bit before we dive into the real, challenge of calculating, carbon emission from the work.
Well, I'll start with the NREL definition of net zero, because I would expand that prompt, Sean, to say, just when someone approaches us and says, hey, I want to do net zero, what we have to contextualize that too, because for first, I'll say there's really no such thing as net zero, that you're hitting zero on the spot. You're always on one side of the line or the other. And so you want to make sure you're on the positive side of that line, that if it's about energy, for instance, that you are actually producing more than what you're going to consume, that if it's on the carbon side, that your building impact over its lifetime is going to be on the negative side, that you're actually going to have less, that the lifetime impact is, it's actually going to find a way to lessen and perhaps even sequester carbon to some extent. There's no such thing as a true on the spot zero. So figure out what the most important side of that line is and shoot for that side of the line. And that becomes really important. But there's something to be said about, okay, we're going to do net zero energy. And you're right, the semantics get into play, but we're going to use it right now to define, okay, take a year, measure the energy use of the building, everything that happens in your project boundary, and do you actually produce more over the course of the year than you consume? If you do, then it's a so-called net zero energy project. But that is, by the NREL definition, site energy. That's talking about the energy that's coming out of your meter. That's what you're using on your site. That's what the utilities basically providing you. But if we talk about source energy, did you know, and this changes on different parts of the country, different parts of the grid network, but did you know that by and large, that NREL data shows that you lose a huge percentage of the energy that's going to come from generation to the actual site, like a huge proportion. And it'll vary in some locations from 40 some percent to about 60 some percent, but there are huge inefficiencies in terms of what's produced at the source and what gets to your site. So if we're talking about net zero source energy, now you're going to have an even bigger solar array, even more wind turbines. You're going to have even more hydro, whatever renewable energy source you're using, because you're accounting for not just what's happening on your site, but how much you're losing by way of getting from the source to your project. And so site energy or net zero source energy, or maybe we're talking about net zero cost. You may have situations where it's just about cost, and the feed-in tariff situation in your location may be such that a kilowatt purchased from the grid is not the same cents per kilowatt hour that you're going to send back. In other words, I might have to purchase at 12 cents. I might only have it bought back at 4 cents. And there's some justification to this, because it takes very real resources to keep the grid maintained. That's the utility grid. We're using their grid. But sometimes the conversation is, all right, we hear what you're saying with the energy give and take. What's just the cost differential at the end of the year? Can I get to a net zero energy cost situation? And that becomes, it has its own complications, and that's its own conversation. And then the fourth one is net zero carbon, that you say, okay, it's not really about the energy cost. It's not really about the kilowatt hours that I'm purchasing or producing. I really want to know, based on my location, I want to know what's happening from a carbon standpoint, because the data I have seen, Sean, indicates that Indiana as a state, and that's, to qualify that, we're taking like the state average, the carbon per kilowatt hour produced is pretty high relative to other states. In fact, the only states at this time that have a greater carbon consequence for how much units of energy they produce is Kentucky, Wyoming, and West Virginia. So we are near the bottom of the list in terms of reducing carbon per kilowatt hour. So if we're trying to come up with a zero carbon project in Indiana, that becomes a different kind of challenge than, say, one in Vermont or maybe California or maybe Washington State. So there are those four definitions, Sean. I was just going to just recap that. Net zero in terms of site energy, source energy, energy cost, and carbon.
And then for net neutral, to adjust or to, achieve net zero, you may need to buy offset credits to achieve net zero, right? That's kind of like the other, I think, nuance here, that you can achieve net zero, but maybe through your operations, you just can't really get there because you generate too much carbon. I mean, it's a process, or the infrastructure is just not capable unless you tear it all down and build it back up. I mean, and is that worth it, right? So then maybe I can do carbon offsets, right, to achieve my net zero, but that's getting you to that net neutral. But you got to factor in all that, right? So that's another component here I thought I would just highlight.
You do. And what I would expand upon, I'll build upon your comment there, Sean, because this gets back to that transportation carbon issue that we talked about. Because if you are driving a combustion engine to your project, and we're taking that into account with our net zero carbon calculations, you're right. We would have to do something to account for that very real fossil fuel usage. And that can take the form of carbon offsets. So for a project, you may have some combination of renewable energy credits and carbon offsets. And that's what we might call a bridge solution for now, that while our industries, and I'm talking infrastructure, I'm talking buildings, I'm talking vehicular, but as we start to decarbonize, and this is going to be a long process, we're still going to need fossil fuels to some extent, but can we offset that usage by directly supporting renewable energy? And you can do that through, I would add the caveat, through certified, perhaps Green E certified renewable energy credits and carbon offsets, that you want to make sure that when you source that, preferably domestically, but make sure that it's certified, make sure that it is being used in a way in which it's going to help really expand and grow those economies.
Yeah, my understanding, that's like the last thing you do after you've tried to, I guess, decarbonize all your operations within all means, and measured it, and then you go, okay, well, this is what's left. Let's go buy some offsets and credits, right? I mean, I think that's the way you would address it early on. But well, how does a project pursue LEED Zero Carbon or LEED Zero Energy or LEED Zero Water certification to become certified?
You would start by setting those clear goals at the beginning of a project that it would require the project team to really set explicitly, this is what we want to do. I would advocate this for any kind of sustainability objective, that the topic of sustainability can be rather abstract, and you can be efficient, you can be energy conscious, you can be resource conscious, but set clear, specific, measurable goals that you can achieve as a team. And from the project outset, while cost is being evaluated and you're bringing all the disciplines together, make sure that you have those clear, measurable goals set. So if you're going for LEED Zero certification, the implication there is that you are going to be measuring and verifying performance. So the moment you set that as a sustainability goal, Sean, it sets very different accountability mechanisms in play, because you always want to design with good intent. If you're going to go for LEED certification or any other kind of green building certification based on design and construction, you're going to have building energy modeling. You're going to, with all the rigors and the best of intent, try to be most reflective of how the building is going to be constructed and operated. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to want to commission your systems. You're going to hire a commissioning authority to come in and make sure that the building systems, perhaps the enclosure, that it's all performing the way that an owner would expect that it would perform, make sure that they get what they think they're paying for, and then you would get certified based on that. based on doing all these things up to the point that the building is complete. So what LEED Zero is saying is, let's now look beyond that occupancy moment in time. Let's now look at what is really happening. And when you start to be held accountable to what's really happening, it changes some of the thinking and some of the approach by everybody involved on a project team, because you know that you're going to have to work in a safety factor. You know that, and what I mean by that is, if you think it's going to take this much in terms of wall insulation and air tightness, if you think it's going to take a certain amount of on-site solar energy production, as an example, you might go a bit above and beyond just so that you are covered for the unknown factors, that the building might not perform just the right way. It might be an especially hot year. It might be an especially cold year. 9 out of 10 mechanical systems on the non-residential side have been shown to have some kind of problem in the first year of operation. Do you have controls in place to catch that soon and to respond to that? But the aggregate effect of all of this, just the rigors that you put into play, the accountability mechanisms, the safety factor that may be in some of the systems, all of this combines to hopefully putting you in a position to succeed, such that when you measure your performance after a year, you are actually in a net zero situation.
So you really got to track this information and monitor these systems and have good data to really assess, and analyze. And you do that, John, over the course of a year, right?
Right. That's the story here. That's the takeaway, is that we have now arrived at the point in the conversation with green building that we are going beyond rules of thumb. We're going beyond designing with good intent. We're going beyond doing everything you can, putting in all these rigors and checks on the design and construction side, to now we're saying what really matters is the performance. And let's actually measure the performance. And if let's put controls in place so that we it's almost like just going to get a physical. You check out what's happening with your body, look at vitals, understand what's happening. If you get some really strange symptoms, you might go and get that checked out. Having ongoing measurement and verification of performance, that is where we are now. It changes the relationship that we may have as a discipline in terms of walking our clients through our projects. That it may be increasingly now we're seeing on the commissioning side, where we're going to have an extended service contract with the commissioning authority to do ongoing monitorization to make sure that things are working right, so that if something goes wrong, you can catch it really quickly and you can respond to it. And there's energy cost savings, there's carbon savings, there's lots of good that can come from that. It's a good investment.
Absolutely.
Be more rigorous with that.
Yeah. I can see that. And I think those are mechanisms you'd want to put in place as you deploy the design and you build it. If we focus just on LEED Zero Carbon, how does one calculate the carbon impacts on their project? I mean, does LEED give you some guidelines there? I'm sure they do, but let's talk about that a little bit.
They do. There's a program guide that breaks that down pretty thoroughly, and it's really looking at it incorporates the carbon that's caused by energy consumption, water consumption, waste generation, and the embodied carbon of the materials of your building, just really looking holistically at all that. And that is that kind of reflects best practice in the industry right now to take account of those carbon impacts. The loop that we got thrown for was when you read the description of what they require you to reflect in the carbon performance of your project, is that transportation impact as well. And that's something that I'm anticipating that many of your listeners and maybe some of the professionals that listen to this from the architecture, engineering, and construction fields maybe haven't been prompted to do yet. That you're hearing, oh yeah, Dan, we look at energy conservation, we look at the energy water nexus. We know it takes water to make energy and energy to make water. We can account for that. Looking at how much carbon comes from the bricks and mortar of our structure. We got all that. Have you looked at the transportation
component?
The transportation component we found out was huge. We actually went through a discovery process with this internally with my firm, because we wanted to really use ourselves as a test case to understand what this data could tell us. And you can't put an energy monitor on something to get your transportation carbon intensity figured out. You're going to have to survey all the users of your building. And that's exactly what we did. We sent a survey out to everybody in our company. We tried to take a poll basically as many users of the building as we could. We got a pretty good response back, and we wanted to set a baseline and then look at what everyone's reporting in. What we discovered, Sean, a few things. One is, as you might anticipate, if you're going to walk, if you're going to bike, if you're going to take a bus to an office such as ours, that's going to be less carbon intensive than driving a vehicle by yourself. If you carpool, less carbon intensity. But here's something else that maybe would be a little eureka moment for us. What do we see right now in workplace trends in a post-pandemic environment? We still see
telecommuting.
Telecommuting, you nailed it, telecommuting.
Yeah.
And we wondered, okay, if our firm has a 3-day-a-week policy, and that means 2 out of 5 days employees may be telecommuting, shouldn't that count? And how much would that account for? So we took all this into consideration. We basically found out, like, what routes do you take? What modes do you take? And what we discovered was that by the aggregate effect of these alternative transportation means, carpooling, telecommuting, all that reduced our own company's carbon intensity from transportation by almost 50%. That's some substantial savings. And we would have no clue if we didn't go through and do this user survey and pull this data. And we did it in accordance with the LEED zero carbon framework. So we took their guidance, and as you might anticipate, some of the multipliers that are attributed to certain modes of transportation, they've got a whole methodology that's laid out in the program guide. So if any listeners want to pull that down, it's listed out in detail. But we took that same methodology and applied it, established that, hey, I'm going to travel 5 days a week into the office baseline versus what's happening in reality, and found that it was reducing it by half, which is phenomenal. The story that we discovered with this project we're working on currently that's pursuing net zero energy and net zero carbon, it's located not in downtown Indianapolis, but in a nearby city, and most of its users will drive to the building. And we were trying to figure out how much that carbon intensity would be. And here's the discovery through that process. Based on typical construction, we discovered that the carbon from transportation was probably about 46% to the 54% of the building. So the building was a little bit more than half of the total carbon. But as we made this building more efficient from an energy standpoint, as we pursued this net zero energy goal, and we found better enclosure systems, more air tightness, more efficient mechanicals, better harvesting of daylight, we did all these things to just bring down the energy use, and as a result, the carbon as much as we could. Now that transportation wedge of the pie goes from 46 to maybe as much as 65. It's
because it's the biggest
majority.
dominant. Yeah, right. Yeah. So you designed out the carbon emission from the new system, right?
Yeah, and that's something that if you don't have the data, it's maybe not so intuitive that the transportation counts for that much. All of a sudden, it's dawning on us, well, this is why LEED is calling for this, that it understands. I remember a New Yorker piece, Sean, I read this in school, and it's one of those things you read that sticks with you forever, that just by virtue of location, somebody living in Manhattan who can walk to almost anything has a much small, even living in not a net zero building, but just kind of a typical building stock you'd find in Manhattan. They found in this research I saw in this piece that you have some of the smallest carbon footprint per capita of anybody in the United States because you're in this dense walkable environment. So that's what LEED zero carbon is keying into, this notion that if you're in walkable communities, bikeable communities, you can get into a bicycle network, you can easily take alternative transportation. That is very real carbon that's being spared. And so can we try to capitalize on that? But where we're also going now with electric vehicles, it's going to be interesting over time as automobile manufacturers are quickly shifting to EVs, what the implications would be there. And as Indiana, much like the rest of the United States, where there's a sort of broader move towards decarbonization, we're moving towards more natural gas, we'll be moving towards other cleaner renewable sources, but the carbon intensity of a kilowatt hour made is going to continue to go down. I don't sit here with you and pretend to have all the answers on where we're going to go next in the future. But you can definitely see the confluence of all these factors, and we're going to get there, Sean. Decarbonization is happening, but it's going to require work on a variety of fronts over the years and decades to come.
So you mentioned the trend now for basically a lot of employees working from home and the impact of the decarbonization that's having in the equations or the calculations, should I say, that you're using. I'm assuming that telecommuting is like it's no carbon no carbon emission impact in that space. I mean, for the most part, you're not really calculating any additional carbon. It's I'm just curious, how far does a person decide they want to take that emission, down the chain before they say, okay, this is far enough for us and we're done, right? I think that's kind of where I'm kind of leading into this question, because I think some people might maybe go too far and some people just definitely don't go far enough, right? So, I mean,
I think taking an evidentiary approach, that as we see the elevation now with corporations of their carbon accountability, that we see this as being a measurable benchmark that they are just taking stock of year in, year out. And we're seeing broader workplace trends of telecommuting in many industries. And we're in the throes of this moment right now, post-pandemic, about where is that sweet spot of just trying to accommodate the workforce, allowing flexibility in our lives, but also what I see trends of is when we come together as teams, when we come together in person, collaboration is up, but maybe when you can telecommute and be a bit more isolated, you can be more productive on different types of tasks. Right. So I think the future is hybrid. The future is options. But I think it's really, really important to acknowledge that there is a carbon consequence to what's happening too. That I remember a year or so ago when we saw carbon emissions markedly step down, and it was painful what was happening globally. It was a painful thing. We all went through it, but you also noted that you saw nature bounce back a bit. You saw emissions drop significantly, and I think that's reflective of what we're seeing here. That every little decision that we make, whether it's a building, whether it's turning off a light switch, whether it's recycling a can, whether it's telecommuting a day or two a week, there's little becomes big, Sean. The aggregate effect of all these things becomes significant. And I think I don't want to, I will use the cliche that you can't improve what you don't measure. We should measure more. We really should measure everything, because when you can see that, you can respond to it.
Well, and you can start to put numbers to, carbon equivalents to a lot of activities that we do now. I mean, and we've kind of figured it out. So I think us having the ability to, understand the impacts is more thoroughly is a really good way to, are we on track to, meet these decarbonization goals? I think it's great. And, where a person lives in relation to, where they work and how that contributes to a company's goal of zero carbon, or I think that, that needs to be considered, especially like for some people, it's like, look, you might want to, if you live, say, I don't know, 50 miles away or 45 miles away. It's like, no, we don't need you to come into work every day. You just need to, like, you can work telecommute from home. I mean, just think of the emission impact of driving, an hour or more in the car one way. That's a big impact. And people have been doing that for years. And so it's it's a cost savings. It's also a decarbonization savings. I mean, it's a big plus if you can do it.
I'll give you another bit of food for thought, which would be, I've been talking about commercial buildings, big complex buildings and elaborate control systems, but you can buy residential energy meters that give you real-time feedback. There's, I've seen some, Sean, that you can get a licensed electrician, put it in your breaker box. It's going to tie into your Wi-Fi. It's going to look at basically it's going to find from the energy usage pattern in your house all the different types of appliances you have. It's going to say, hey, we think we found an appliance, and it isolates these different fingerprints of energy use, and you can identify it. What I'm getting at is, through technology now, and in this smart technology that we have that's able to glean all these different ways in which even your house is using energy. This is like a $250 meter. You put it in, and here's what we're finding with the research is that by giving people that real-time feedback in their homes, they're saving on average 14% in energy, in taking all the energy cost that comes with it. And that, I think, is really noteworthy, because that has nothing to do with energy efficiency upgrades. You're not
That's
changing out your
usage.
windows. It's all it is saying, hey, I'm giving you feedback in real time in such a way that you can directly respond to it, that you can flip
Right.
off a light switch and you see the kilowatts go down, that people understand that direct relationship. And just by that one thing, giving you a little monitor that's giving you real-time energy usage, 14% reduction.
Well, just, I mean, I think in the industry we call that vampire energy, right? So it's like you've got things plugged into your sockets that stay on, that just eats up, erodes energy. It's not a lot, but over time it just sucks and it just adds. And if you can turn things off, unplug, disconnect, before you know it, you can achieve, easy milestones of, 14, 15, 20% energy reductions. I think that's big. And
This
that little
makes me think
device
of
would be great.
This makes me think of Donella Meadows, places to intervene in a system, that when you give people feedback loops in real time, I think of the analogy of turning on hot water in a shower, that if you can in real time dial it, and you turn it hot, turns hot. Oh, I can adjust it. I can adjust it now in real time, hot and cold, get it just right really quickly. We've all had experiences with old plumbing systems. Maybe they got the dual pipe hot and cold, and you're trying to throttle one up and down. You got to wait 20 seconds, and then you feel it and it's too hot. Now it's scalding. I have to dial it back. Now it's too cold, and you dial it up again. That's I hope a relatable analogy to the power of real-time feedback. When you have that delayed feedback, you're not as accurate. You're not able to respond as readily. But when you can dial it up immediately, there's just something to be said about the power of user behavior informed by just giving people data.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, you talked a little bit about doing these occupant surveys to kind of, figure out the employees' impact of their carbon impact to the equation that you have to, assess when you're doing this LEED zero carbon, because not only assessing the energy delivery or energy consumption, whether that's, natural gas, electrical, you name it, but you're also looking at the transportation. And to get that information from the employees, man, that could be a big lift for some people, don't you think?
It is. It can take on a few different forms. A decade ago, we were sending Survey Monkey emails that were prompting people to go in and fill out a 20-point survey and say, how do you feel thermally about your environment? Hot, cold, or just right? And we have now helped our clients do that in a way that's more holistic. It's going beyond thermal comfort to consider acoustic comfort, lighting comfort, how a space makes you feel. And I think that more comprehensive approach to getting user feedback is important. When it comes to that real-time feedback loop and what that can do to inform clients and users of spaces, I can give you a few different examples of how I've seen that start to take shape in the environment. You've walked into a space before, Sean, and in the lobby, there's a monitor and it says, hey, in real time, this is how much energy we're producing through our on-site renewables. Here's how much we're using. I've seen that start to get gamified a bit. There was this project in Illinois, I think it was for a dorm, and they were they're piloting this interface that shows basically a digital fish tank with all these little cartoon fishes in it. And it was for I think this was a dorm. I think it was a multi-resident situation. But for the sake of conversation, every dorm had a fish. So you knew your fish. It didn't have your name on it. It didn't say Sean Grady. It didn't say Dan Overbey. It just, you knew your fish. And the more agile and active that fish was near the top of the tank, the better you were doing in terms of the relative energy consumption expenditures of your unit. If you had the slower fish near the bottom, you knew that relative to everyone else, you weren't doing so well. And then the overall quality of the water in the tank was reflective of the overall usage. So you start to gamify this, where you want to have your fish at the top being agile and moving quickly.
You don't want to be the bottom dweller.
You don't want to be the catfish of the tank.
You don't want to be the bottom dweller. People are going to call you out. That's good. I like that idea. Well, that's good. And then just to get the from an occupant survey wise as well, just to get their information from their transportation modes and, how far they go drive and what vehicles do they, use. And I mean, that's a lot of, maintaining of data and, cause I mean, I don't know about you, but there's a lot of companies that have a lot of employee turnover, right? I mean, that's got to be a fairly significant lift to keep that kind of ongoing, managed, understanding what's happening, just to keep that information accurate.
It is. It's something that you'd want to do with some predictable frequency, probably no less than once a year. And I think if the user group of a space understands the importance of that data, you're going to get a higher response rate.
Yeah.
And LEED does set a threshold for LEED zero carbon that they want a certain percentage, and it's a fairly low percentage. I want to say it's around 20%, that you need to have a decent sample size that you can now, it's like getting polling results on an election night. It's like you get enough respondents, you can extrapolate and figure out what it is for the entire group, because you're never going to get 100% reporting. When we did this internally at my firm, we got about 60%. And I think the reason it was so high, Sean, is because we communicated what we were trying to accomplish, that people could appreciate why we were sending that out. Because the last thing you want is another prompting in your inbox, another app you got to have on your phone that's going to give you a push notification, say, hey, how are you feeling about your space right now? Hey, how are you driving to work? We get enough of that. We're just inundated with that all the time. But if people can appreciate that they are the feedback mechanism, that's the only way we're going to get that data. I think you can cultivate.
They buy into the mission. Yeah, they buy into the mission. I'll support that. I mean, I'll take the 2-3 minutes, whatever it is, to 5 minutes to take the quiz or the survey or whatever it is. Let's put the feedback in. I think that's good. And you're right, communicating these types of strategies or the objectives that you're trying to achieve ahead of time, asking for support, I think is the best way to get people to buy in, right? So, well, I mean, so, you get these projects, you don't really know where these projects may come. I mean, you can't always predict the most ideal setting to, take advantage of a more favorable transportation, carbon score, right? So there's always going to be like limitations as how much you could really achieve, right? I mean, let's be honest, like you just mentioned, you've got the nice facility that's on the outskirts of town that people are going to have to drive to, versus if there was right downtown and most of the employees would, actually work in the downtown area. That doesn't really happen in reality. We're not really a super commuter friendly country, unless you live like maybe in New York City and a few of those other places that have a nice robust rail, subway system, but how are we going to address that piece of the equation?
I think there won't be a silver bullet. There won't be a one size fits all solution. I think based on location, there's going to be different opportunities. But what I do see in central Indiana, across not just Indianapolis but the surrounding communities, is I am seeing this growing, robust bicycle network, and I am seeing that starting to interconnect. I'm starting to see development happening along transportation nodes where that you can get to, and there's a cluster of development that's going to be near a bus rapid transit or a bike network or some kind of a greenway. And I think it's going to require more of that. I think give people options, put them in a position to be able to understand the accountability of the decisions. I think we are going to see the electrification of combustion vehicles. You're seeing a growing number of EVs. That technology is going to improve. The battery technology is going to become more reliable and cleaner over time, but it's not going to happen overnight. We're going to still have bridge solutions in the meantime, and that still includes the purchasing carbon offsets for that. But I think when we can support those just walkability, proximity to amenities, making it easier to bike to a facility, that you can start to have this interconnection of different modes of transportation. I think that it's going to take the balanced effect of all of this, in addition to decarbonization of our grid, decarbonization of our vehicular fleet, and we start to, and this is going to be, you can look at energy forecasts, Sean. I look at reports that aggregate the forecast from a number of sources in the industry, everyone from petroleum producers to renewable energy groups, and nobody is pretending like we're going to get completely away from fossil fuels anytime soon. But you do see a common trend across all of it, that it is becoming more economically viable, that the technology is improving, and we are seeing that you'll start to just have a more diverse mix of energy resources. You are going to see across all models, you see this decarbonization happening. Now, how quickly it'll happen, what the effect of government subsidies and different incentives are going to have, that remains to be seen. But we are seeing the change happen. I know in my world, in the building design and construction industry, there's a push toward, okay, let's take the 39% carbon that comes from buildings and let's reduce that as much as we can. And we're making progress there too. Over, since the 2030 challenge was issued, something like 2005, 2006, we've seen across different sectors on average around a 20%, in some cases more, 20 to 25% drop in the energy use, the impact of our buildings. We are getting there. It's just, you could argue it's not enough, fast enough, but I choose to have an optimistic approach to all this, Sean, that we are seeing the change happening, that truly I want your listeners to know that every little decision matters, that every little bit, take every decision you make, from turning off a light switch to switching over to an EV to adding more cellulose insulation in your attic. Take that decision and scale it up toward an entire population base, and you'll see the aggregate effect of all of our little decisions. Little becomes big, but the data is showing us that those accountability mechanisms, by feedback loops and performance, whether it's a building, whether it's a transportation survey with employees, that feedback loops, accountability mechanisms, data, getting feedback on what the impact of your decisions are, makes all the difference in the world. If you don't feel like you're having an impact, if you can't look and see that even your smallest decisions are taken into account, it feels like it doesn't matter. I do think that there is something so important to measuring and following the data.
I think too, you're talking about, I think master design and planning of communities, and designing these greenways, these bikeways, these better commuter pathways and transportation modes, I think we have a lot of opportunity to improve in that area of our, future growth of society. And I think we're going to see big trends in that area of our design and growth of these communities as we build them, where more people are more, concerned about these aspects of daily life. Do we have, walkable places to work or bike, or take public transportation, and is it affordable, and is it electric, is it I mean, they're people are really, I think, more passionate now about this topic, to see decarbonization occur. Everyone's worried about the climate change, and if you haven't been paying attention, I mean, just outside, just look around. I mean, we know climate change is happening. The natural events that goes on, it's obvious, right? It's not something you can just say, oh, it's a once in a lifetime, it's a 100-year situation. I mean, we've been having 100-year situations in the past 10 years on a regular basis. It seems like it's not something normal, right? So at least in my lifetime.
Yeah, I completely agree that we see the evidence, look at the data, but you're right. We can relate to this in our everyday lives, and I would just stress that to everybody, that every little decision matters. And you made me think, Sean, when you're describing that too. There is the intersectionality of human health with walkable communities. It gets into issues of active design and such too. So when I come back for episode 126, or whatever my pace is, we can talk about the intersectionality of healthy buildings with sustainable design.
Yeah, no, that would be great. I mean, we've done a lot of deep dive in here into LEED zero carbon, and what impacts are affecting the assessment and the calculations, and the determination of the design of a LEED carbon building. But there's the LEED zero energy discussion. There's the LEED zero water discussion. There's the LEED zero waste discussion. I mean, all of those have enough. They probably warrant their own discussion, to be honest with you. So maybe there's going to be somebody that's listening who is a LEED expert in one of these other three, who might want to come on. But certainly, Dan, will keep you on the roster here. We'll bring you back and have you come back, and we'll talk some more about LEED and architectural design. And I've been pretty fascinated about solar power, and how that could really make a big difference in our residential communities, and just communities in general, if we had more of an adoption of that. And from an energy perspective, that could go a long way of getting off of fossil fuels, to power a lot of the energy consumption that we rely on. So there's a lot of topics there we can uncover and unpack. But man, this has been great, Dan. I mean, there's a lot here. I'm glad you get to come on and talk a little bit about how transportation, the emission associated with that, is being factored into the carbon emission consumption of all the other impacts and inputs from your LEED zero carbon certification process. But and the research you did was pretty fascinating, and I'm going to put a link to your research on that article on the website, so when people look for that, they can see that. Also, I'll put a link also to the LEED zero criteria for people to take a look at too, because I think that's important to have a view of what you are using as a template to assess and evaluate this criteria.
Well, thanks for that, Sean. It's always a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to come back anytime and talk about sustainability and the building, design, and construction industry anytime.
Absolutely. Well, Dan, hey, great to talk to you again. And as always, good to see you. And I'm sure we'll get together here soon to catch up. But in the meantime, for our listeners, thanks ET Nation for joining us today. And we'll get this out there shortly, and let the listeners digest this LEED carbon zero topic, and ask for some more information on these other components. I think it'll be really good. So thanks a lot, everybody, and talk to you soon.